Greetings, everyone. A warm welcome to the webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is based at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, co-hosting this webinar with my colleague, Heather Yoakum. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the North Central US that encompasses the Missouri and the Upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speakers, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat box anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first during the Q&A in the order they are received. So today we have a special webinar, which is presented as a collaboration between a climate tool developer represented by Katherine Hegewisch and the users of the tool represented by the other three speakers from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I'm really quite grateful to all of them for putting this presentation together on a very short notice. So let me briefly introduce them. Katherine Hegewisch is a project scientist at the University of California Merced, where she works as a climate data provider, analyst, and web tool developer. She's the developer of the Climate Toolbox, which we'll be talking about today, which hosts a variety of web tools for visualizing climate data. Katherine has a PhD in physics from Washington State University. Next, we have John Guinotte, who is a spatial ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in its Ecological Service Program, based out of the Legacy Region 6 office in Lakewood, Colorado. John assists Fish and Wildlife Service field offices across regions 5 and 7 with analytical, geospatial, and statistical needs for listing or delisting species under the Endangered Species Act species status assessments. John's work also supports habitat conservation plans, recovery, critical habitat, climate vulnerability, and mitigation. John has a PhD in tropical environmental studies and geography from James Cook University in Australia. And next we have Alex Kasdin, who is a species assessment team project manager with the Ecological Services Program of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She also works out of the regional office in Lakewood, Colorado. She leads different teams of biologists crafting species status assessments to inform classification decisions under the Endangered Species Act. She also helps decision makers apply the standards in the Act to determine if the species warrant listing. Alex has a bachelor's degree in ecology and evolutionary biology and a master's in public affairs from Princeton University. And finally, we have Aimee Crittendon, who is a biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Western Colorado Ecological Services field office, where her work focuses on federally threatened and endangered species listing and recovery. Before her work with the service, Aimee served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Botswana, and then went on to work for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources as an aquatic invasive species response coordinator. Aimee has a master's in conservation biology and watershed ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And with that, I'll ask Alex to please take it away.
Thank you, Imtiaz. Okay. So I am just going to open this conversation with a bit of a background on species status assessments and how we might be interested in climate information as a part of species status assessments. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. And I just want to say that I borrowed these graphics and slides from our SSA framework documentation, so I can't take credit for these awesome visuals. So species status assessments are the framework that we use to analyze species viability to inform decisions under the Endangered Species Act. SSAs might inform whether to list a species or whether to delist a species. And we also use SSA reports as the foundation for crafting recovery plans for listed species. They are a systematic, peer-reviewed way of characterizing the species' resiliency, redundancy, and representation, something that we'll refer to as the 3 Rs. And the 3 Rs make up what we term viability. Resiliency is the ability to sustain populations in the face of stochastic events, or for populations to recover from years with low reproduction or reduced survival. It is associated with population size, growth rate, gender ratios, habitat quality and quantity, and sometimes we refer to it as sort of the health of a population. Redundancy is the ability for the species to withstand catastrophic events for which adaptation is unlikely. And redundancy is associated with the number and distribution of populations across the landscape. Representation is the ability of a species to adapt to changes in the environment. It is associated with its ecological, genetic, behavioral, morphological, or other forms of diversity. So in sum, viability is the ability of the species to maintain multiple sustaining populations across the species' ecological settings in order to withstand catastrophes, environmental stochasticity, and changes in environmental conditions. So the basic structure of an SSA analysis is that we first identify the habitat or demographic factors that a species needs to be resilient. So this might be that the species requires certain food sources, certain soil types, or a particular number of individuals in a population. A common species need that we consider is whether the species has any particular climatic requirements. So that might be, do they need a certain amount of water available? That's common for plants that we study. Do they have a particular temperature tolerance that needs to be this level of cold, or it can't be too hot? It is rare that we have studies informing these thresholds. In other words, it's rare that we have some sort of experimental study that's told us exactly how much water a species needs or a clear temperature tolerance threshold. So the methods that we will show you today, and that Aimee will discuss in more detail, make an assumption that the range of climatic variation the species experienced in the historical past represent the climatic conditions the species needs and tolerates. So we will use things like the Climate Toolbox to help us inform what the species needs by investigating the climate conditions it's experienced in the past. After identifying species needs, we then identify whether those needed resources are currently available to the species and whether the species currently has the demographic conditions it requires. That's the species' current condition in this graphic. Then we project forward whether these needs will be more or less available in the future under multiple different future scenarios. And that characterizes the species' future condition. Can you go to the next slide, please? Ooh, there you go. So in this graphic, the green and red habitat and demographic boxes represent the species' needs, either their resource needs or their demographic needs, like I described earlier. And then this anthropogenic and environmental factors box all the way to the left characterizes the stressors or conservation efforts that might be influencing the availability of those needs. And climate change might be one of those anthropogenic/environmental factors that we consider that influences the current or future availability of those needs. It could influence whether the food sources are still present, and it could also influence directly whether it has the right amount of water or the right temperature. We also might consider other stressors like grazing, collection, that can reduce the availability of these needs, or conservation efforts that can increase their availability. So one example would be if we identified a climatic variable as a habitat need, let's say water availability, we would need to analyze whether the species currently has enough water available to meet that need and how that water availability might change in the future given changing stressors like climate change. In order to do this, we typically need to understand the current average levels of precipitation, temperature, et cetera, and how these values could change in the future under multiple different climate scenarios, so different GCM or RCP combination scenarios. And that all taken together would inform the resiliency of each population, which then we can use to inform redundancy and representation and overall species viability in the SSA. And that's it from me. So onwards.
Okay, so the next section is we're going to talk about the Climate Toolbox. My name is Katherine Hegewisch, and the Climate Toolbox is a collection of climate tools where each one of these boxes here. So when you go to climatetoolbox.org, this is the landing page that you see, and we're going to go into the tool a little bit in a couple seconds, so you'll see this. But each one of these boxes represents a different one of the tools. And so you can see here that there are at least like 15 different tools in these boxes that you can open up and explore. And the different tools show climate data summaries on maps, graphs, and dashboards. And you can get to the tools from the landing page by clicking on these little blue launch tool buttons to open a tool in the browser window. The goal of the Climate Toolbox is to help make climate data accessible to a wide swath of people for decision-making related to climate, water, fire danger, and agriculture. And specifically, we're seeing here an application to ecology through monitoring species, through species assessments with fish and wildlife. The data sets used in the Climate Toolbox are scientifically sound. They're used by climate researchers in published and peer-reviewed literature like the National Climate Assessments that recently came out. The Toolbox takes the data sets and makes them usable by anyone interested in learning to use them. So the power of the tools in the toolbox really comes from the data sets that they're based on. First, we have climate data, and such as the daily weather data at the ground surface. And this data is coming from GridMet, which is a blend of both satellite and ground station data. It's available from 1979 to yesterday. It's available over the contiguous USA, so it definitely covers the north central part for this webinar. And it is gridded data on 4 kilometer grids, which is 2.5 miles on each side. So here's like a grid cell here. And what this means, and we have surface weather data of temperature, precipitation, humidity, winds, and wind direction too, and solar radiation. And because it's gridded data, you get one value, a single value, say for precipitation for each grid cell here. So this value will then represent the average precipitation over that grid cell. And this kind of obscures the spatial variation that might happen within a grid cell, say to do complex topography. But this is just a consideration you need to know in dealing with the data in the toolbox, is that it is using gridded data. And second, we have hydrology data, and it is coming from by feeding in climate data into the variable infiltration capacity model, which is the VIC model. And basically in this model, each grid cell is given a land surface and 3 soil layers, and the water balance for that grid cell is decided to give daily values of evaporation, soil water, snow water equivalent, and soil moisture at the 3 levels. It also has runoff for streams and lakes and base flow. And so the result is that in the Climate Toolbox, you'll find summary data for climate metrics and water metrics coming from that GridMet and VIC modeling. So you'll find this kind of data, but you'll also see a bunch of derived data that's useful for ecology and fire danger. For example, the first day of the fall freeze each year, or the number of days that an area has not seen rain greater than 0.1 inches. And also some other metrics that are useful for looking at soil moisture, like the Palmer Drought Severity Index, or drought, like the Standardized Precipitation Index. So, so we're going to go into a tool, actually. So here is the Climate Toolbox. And again, you can get to that by using any web browser and just going to climatetoolbox.org. And this is the landing page that you get when you go there. And all you need to do, there's a navigation bar on the top that'll give you some information. You can select a tool from here. You can also get information about data. We have some case studies, including one by MTS on species assessments. So that's very applicable to this webinar here. And we also have some tool summaries and guidance information along the top here. But in the Climate Toolbox, if we look at we can open a sample tool just to look at. This is one that for looking at historical data. And I'm just going to launch the tool here. And we're going to see that in this example tool here, we kind of see the general layout for a tool from the toolbox. We get this initial splash screen where you can either initially take a tour, which I totally recommend for all the tools when you first come here, or you can set a location or go to the tool. In a general tool like this, the first thing to note about the toolbox is that all the help information is up in these little buttons in the upper right corner. This is where you can get documentation about the data sets or information about the different variables, some information about how the calculations were done, etc. You can also get information about how to cite the tool or to take a tour, which it goes through and steps through how for this tool, you've got some information in the upper right, and then you can choose a location for your climate data. This is pretty much universal across all the tools. Here we can choose a location from either a point location or get data that's an area average over a rectangular area or a county or a Huck watershed. And then there's a section where you choose the data here, and we'll go look at this in a section. Normally the options are on the left and the data visualization is on the right. And then there's some other options for tailoring the data. So in this tool, we can select we can look at annual values of different summaries from the climate data. So for example, I'll look at that day of, so we've got here some different climate variables that we can look at, some different ag variables, energy variables, and some drought metrics. I'll just look at the date of the last spring freeze, which could be very useful for habitats. And what we see here, and we see it at a certain location, which is my location here. But basically, if we choose a location at a point location, we can also enter in an area and like Boulder, Colorado, and just set the location. We can also enter in the specific lat long or drag the marker around as well. So when we set that location, then we come back to the tool and the data is updated. So what we see here is the date of the last spring freeze. Here it's just defined when minimum temperatures are finally not freezing anymore. So they're not, the minimum temperature stays above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So we see the data here for this location from 1979 up until 2021, showing the summaries of when the last spring freeze was for the different years. And yep, that's right. And then we can also add a best fit line on this and kind of do see some regression and see if there are any trends. So this is just an example of what can be done with one of the tools, which is called the historical tracker tool. Another tool that is useful also for the fish and wildlife and looking and exploring the historical climate data is the historical climate scatter. It's similar. You can see it looks very similar. We have options on the left, location setter. Here again, it's the same selections, but we can do a scatter plot and see like precipitation, January precipitation for all the years compared to maximum daily temperature on this axis, and see a scatter plot over the different years. We can also download the data here. And if I hit download data, I'll get the data here in an Excel file. So this is a way to kind of pull data out fairly quickly. Okay, so that's an example, 2 examples from the Climate Toolbox. And then we have so we have historical data from GridMet, but we also have future projection data in the Climate Toolbox. And this is the most useful for the Fish and Wildlife Service for these SSAs. So the data that is in the Climate Toolbox originates with global climate modeling, where scientists are using computer simulations to conduct experiments and test hypotheses about our changing climate. And these are done by simulating global weather in the atmosphere, ocean, land surface, and cryosphere by chopping up everything into the whole atmosphere into 3-dimensional grid cells. For example, a 3-dimensional grid cell of a section of the atmosphere might look like this to the right here, where inside it there's an assumption about what's going on about clouds and if there's precipitation or not and what form that precipitation takes. And the model also connects all these aspects of the Earth system and has models for feedback mechanisms. So there's a lot of science. There's a lot that science knows here, but there are some things that scientists are still working on, and clouds are technically one of them. But all the global climate modeling centers have code to reflect what we know about the feedbacks and the deterministic climate. So back in 2010, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, created a project. Well, actually, it was the fifth phase of the CMIP project, which is a coupled model intercomparison project to create an ensemble of future climate projections. And so phase 5 was CMIP 5, and it was completed in 2011. And phase 6 is CMIP 6 is currently being completed actually right now. In CMIP 5, there were over 40 different climate modeling centers around the world that were contributing outputs to the CMIP project. And the climate outputs that were available, that we used from CMIP 5, were the daily outputs of temperature, precipitation, humidity, wind, and radiation. And basically every model ran the same climate experiment as a simulation of global weather for a historical and a future time period. In the historical time period, the simulation started with a pre-industrial initial condition of greenhouse gas emissions. We extracted 1950 to 2005 for these simulations. And then for the future simulations, each model simulated an emission pathway to obtain certain levels of radiative forcing by 2100. Again, this is CMIP 5 that I'm talking about here. So for example, there were 4 key emission scenarios labeled RCPs. RCP is representative concentration pathway. There was an RCP 2.6, 4.5, 6.0, and 8.5. And for example, RCP 8.5 was a high emission scenario to get to 2100. And it's a business as usual extension of our current emission pathways, where it achieves 8.5 watts per meter squared by 2100. So that's the 8.5 is that where it ends up going with radiative forcing by 2100. RCP 4.5 was a low emission scenario. We also use that on the Climate Toolbox, and it's a reduced emission pathway from where there is global mitigation of emissions. So for perspective, the goal of the Paris climate agreements of not exceeding a change of 2 degrees Celsius in global average temperature fit in here to be just a little bit above the RCP 2.6 scenario, which many agree is just really unlikely at this point. So the outputs from the global climate models come out on roughly 200 mile by 200 mile grid cells. The different models have different resolutions, but that's about right. And so this would mean about maybe 20 grid cells for Colorado. But there's a lot of differences in climate within that 200 mile grid cells over the complex topography, especially in a place like Colorado. So there's just a real need for finer resolution climate projections. And also, as with all the models, the average temperatures on these grid cells coming out of the global climate models is not likely to match average temperatures we actually see on the ground. So to correct these biases, from the model and ground observations, and also to increase the resolution of the data, we apply a statistical downscaling utilizing the same gridded observations from the historical data in the toolbox, which is that GridNet data. And basically we do a fancy interpolation of the coarse grid cells here and to a much finer resolution, and which utilizes the distribution of temperatures seen on past 2.5 mile grid cells, and we get this as a result. And this corrects model biases and also makes a finer resolution data set. So the result for our future climate data is a data set of future climate projections. And for the Climate Toolbox, we have 20 different global climate models in there, and you'll see acronyms like CAN, CM5, and those are the different global climate models. And they're from CMIP 5, so they're the previous 5th assessment or 5th phase of CMIP. And for scenarios, we have the historical and we have RCP 4.5 and 8.5 for future pathways. The downscaling is done using a method called MACA, which was created by John Abatsoglu from UC Merced. And the training data that we use is GridNet from 1979 to 2012. And this basically ensures and the spatial coverage is 4 kilometers, just like GridNet, and we have daily projections. And the nice thing about this for the Fish and Wildlife Service is that when they use future climate projections from the Climate Toolbox, these future climate projections were trained so that they have the statistics, historical statistics of the GridMet data set. So they can also use the Climate Toolbox to get historical data from GridMet. And this provides a kind of a seamless process for them in looking at future data and historical data together so that they don't have to worry so much about biases. There are some little biases here and there, but most of them have been removed. Yeah, and then for the future data, again, we have all these same temperature and water metrics, and then we have a bunch of other derived metrics. Some of them are the same as what we have in the historical, and then some are some summaries like coldest winter day, hottest summer day, the day of the first fall freeze or last spring freeze, the growing season, days of max temperature greater than 86 degrees Fahrenheit. These are some ecological metrics that are of interest in characterizing a species habitat for the fish and wildlife. Also, we have some fire danger metrics here. We have the 100-hour fuel moisture, vapor pressure deficit, days of extreme fire danger, and those can also be very useful in characterizing a habitat and also risks to the habitat for different species. And then finally, I'm going to go into just some other future Climate Toolbox tools. And it looks like I only have a 4 minutes left. So anyway, I'm going to look into just some future data real quick. And these are climate tools that Aimee is also going to look at. So I'm just going to look at the future box plots tool. This is one of the ones that is utilized by the Fish and Wildlife. And basically in this tool, you get to select your variable, right? So we can again look at just the day of first fall freeze, just to be consistent with what we saw before. And we can select either the RCP 4.5 or 8.5 for a future emission scenario. Here we're looking at 8.5, which is that business as usual extension to the future. And what we see here is we see a box plot of projections from the different models, and all the little dots are the different GCMs. They're the different global climate models. So you can see the little acronyms, INMCM4, NORESMA, IPSL. Those are the different climate models. And this is then showing the variation in the climate models for the day of first fall freeze for this historical period. And there is variation because all the different models for the historical period have different assumptions about climate feedbacks, and so they don't have the same answer for the historical period, and they won't necessarily match also the GridMet historical answer. But using the information about the biases, we've corrected for some of the biases with the downscaling process. But you see that even after the correction, there is still some variability here in the day of the first fall freeze. And so that's something to be expected when you're looking at the global climate model historical data. And then for the early, mid, and late century, we see here the range and projections, the little dots, for that first fall freeze. And you can see generally the fall freeze is going to later in the year, which is consistent with what we'd expect with global warming. But we can also see information here about the mean, which are these blue lines, seeing that that date is increasing. And then also we can see the spread of the different models gives us information about the uncertainty in that in the day of the first fall freeze from the projections. Another tool that I'm just going to look at real quick, and again, Aimee's going to look at this, is the future climate scatter. And this is where we select, we can select a variable for the x-axis and a variable for the y-axis. And we can do that here by looking at, like here we've got winter precipitation on the y-axis and summertime maximum temperature on the x-axis, and we basically get a scatter plot of these are all the different, the yellow dots are for the early part of the century, and it's the changes with respect to the historical. Each dot represents a different model, and so you can see the spread of the models here, and the pink represents the mid-century, the scatter of the space of climate projections for the mid-century, and then the purple represents the late century. And yep, And then the last thing is the Climate Mapper tool. This is our multi-purpose mapping tool that you can actually look at historical maps of historical data here. So the GridMet data, and for example, we can look at current precipitation anomalies. Fish and Wildlife is more interested in trends. So yeah, so also in this, we can look at future projections. And again, this is where you can choose the RCP, future pathway. You can choose a variable from a bunch of these different variables. And you can also choose a specific model or look at the ensemble mean. And so this basically shows a map of what the projections are for changes in winter precipitation for the mid-century with respect to the historical simulations. And you can click on the map to actually see a specific location or zoom in, and then there's a whole bunch of GIS kind of abilities here. Yeah, so that's a kind of an overview of the Climate Toolbox and also some of the more specific tools that the Fish and Wildlife is interested in using for species assessments. So I'm going to turn it over now. Oh, I forgot one thing. So all the different tools in the toolbox have different variables. We saw that like in the drop down here for the Climate Mapper tool, there's different variables here. There's like precipitation, potential evapotranspiration, vapor deficit. Other tools might have some other variables. And one of the things that confuses people when they come to the toolbox is because there's different variables in every tool, they don't know where to find the variables that they're looking for, that they're interested in. So if you click this little find your variable cloud here, it's actually a link to a lookup tool. It's a little bit hidden here, but your find your variable tool is basically you can look at all of the variables that are in the toolbox somewhere. So for example, days with heat index greater than a certain temperature, those freeze dates, plant heat's tolerance zone, climate water deficit, heating degree days. We've got some evaporative stress index, landscape evaporative response index, Palmer indices, and then the hydrology data, surface soil moisture, runoff, reservoirs, groundwater, for fire metrics, we have all these. And basically when you choose one of these things, like the first fall freeze, it provides a list of tools over here that actually provide that variable so that you can use these tools to get information about first fall freezes. So that's a very useful tool to kind of find what you need in the Climate Toolbox. Okay. So that is it for me, and I'm going to turn it over to Aimee.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by saying that no two SSAs are the same. They can be very different depending on the amount of data that we have for a species or our understanding of its stressors, understanding of how the species responds to those stressors, and our ability to project all of that information into the future. But two things that are common to all SSAs are an analysis of current conditions and an analysis of future conditions. So today I'm going to use just one SSA as an example from the Colorado hookless cactus. This is just one example of how we use climate data from the Climate Toolbox to inform current and future conditions. So next slide.
And Katherine, can you go in the slideshow mode? Thank you.
So this is a condition category table. It's common in a lot of SSAs. It's basically a matrix of demographic and environmental variables that's used to explain how well the needs of the species are being met or the resiliency of each population or analytical unit. Using this, we measure the current status of each of these metrics, and we project how each of these metrics will change into the future. So you can see here, summer water deficit was one of the metrics that we used to assess the condition of Colorado hookless cactus. And this species is a cactus. It's adapted to semi-arid climate, but it's still a plant. So we know it needs water to survive and to reproduce. No one's directly measured soil moisture in the species habitat, so we don't have that historic data to rely on. So instead, we turn to the Climate Toolbox to look for something that could tell us about that historic, current, and future soil moisture conditions for the species. Summer water deficit is basically, it's a combination of multiple climate variables. It represents both the supply and the demand for water. It's potential evapotranspiration minus precipitation, and we use that as a proxy for soil moisture and ultimately telling us about the amount of available water for the species. And to develop these high, moderate, and low thresholds, we compared demographic data from the species to our climate variable data. We can assume that since the species is still here and thriving today, it's able to withstand climate conditions it's experienced in the past. And also those past years of data can give us an indication of the species' climate requirements and how the species responds to annual fluctuations. So by identifying historically good and bad years for the species, we're able to compare those years to historic water deficit levels and come up with these thresholds. Next slide. Okay, that's what we did. Let's talk about how we did it using the Climate Toolbox. In the toolbox, there are all of these different tools that you can choose from to visualize and download historic and future climate data. Next slide. And in each of the tools, this has been mentioned a little bit, but you can define the location of your species habitat. So the toolbox will deliver downscaled climate data that's specific to your species. You can choose which variables and timeframes you're interested in. And Katherine mentioned that you'll notice that not every tool has every variable built into it. So if there's a variable you're looking for and you don't see it, try a different tool. Being able to quickly see a scatter plot or box plot is helpful in this case for our historic and current data. We wanted the raw data so we could use the annual variation to develop our thresholds, and the little download button in the corner let us do that. Next slide. So it gave us an Excel file that contained the data that we had selected from the drop-down menus. And then from this, we were able to calculate the historic mean, which for us was the mean of the years 1979 to 2000. Then we used that to inform the thresholds that we put into our condition category table that I showed you earlier. And then using the historic mean, we calculated the current condition, which was the mean of the last 10 years compared to that historic mean. Next slide. So for this species, anything within one standard deviation of the historic mean was considered high condition. Within 2 standard deviations, moderate, and greater than 2 standard deviations, that was a low condition. And again, this was used by or developed by comparing those good and bad years to that historic data. Next slide. This looks very much the same as what we did for Colorado hookless cactus, but this is actually a similar approach that we used for a different SSA. All I want to point out here is that hookless cactus is a hardy species. It doesn't have a strong response to drought. We used a similar approach with another species that is much more vulnerable to drought. So in this case, we used a half standard deviation instead of that full standard deviation from the historic mean. And I just want to point this out because the data can inform these thresholds, but it's still our responsibility to figure out like what these data are telling us for these species. Next slide. All right, looking into the future, it would be impossible for us to analyze every possible combination of predicted changes in stressors, land management, environmental factors. So what we do in SSAs is we bracket that range of plausible future scenarios. What's the best case scenario we can reasonably foresee, and what's the worst case scenario? And we generally also add kind of a middle of the road scenario that represents a continuation of current trends. So for the climate portion of this, the interactive tools in the Climate Toolbox are really helpful. This future scatter plot was especially helpful in helping us bracket those best and worst case scenarios. So with this tool, we can look at 2 variables. For example, here on the screen, we're looking at projected changes in precipitation and mean temperature over 3 future timeframes, and we see all of the different model outputs. So remember, we want to capture that range of plausible future scenarios. So rather than analyzing how every model projection would impact the species, we use this tool to choose just a couple of models that represent the range of our future projections. So for hookless cactus, our foreseeable future was mid-century. So we're only interested in the model results for that time frame. So in this image, it's those light pink dots. In the lower right of that time frame, we have the models that predict a larger increase in temperature and a decrease in precipitation. So these are our hot and dry scenarios. In the upper left, we have the model outputs where the temperature is still going to increase compared to the current mean, but not as much as our hot and dry projections. And there's also a predicted increase in precipitation compared to historic. So these are our warm and wet scenarios. So we can use this to choose just a few models to represent that entire range of predicted changes in climate. We can hover over the dots of the scatter plot, get the values for those variables, and also the name of the model so that we can download additional data based on those same models later. Next. All right, going back to our spreadsheet, we can use the values from those few models that we choose, input them into our spreadsheet and see how much they vary from that historic mean we calculated before, and that becomes the future condition for the climate metric in each of the future scenarios of our SSA. Next slide. And then here's how it looks in our SSA report. On the left, there's the optimistic scenario, and on the right, the pessimistic scenario. And you can see that in our pessimistic scenario, summer water deficit changes enough to drop that metric into a moderate category. But in our optimistic scenario, although there is a change in the water deficit, it's still within that one standard deviation of this historic mean. And now I will hand it off to John.
Great, thanks, Amy. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Well, thanks. My name is John Guinotte. I'm the Decision Support Branch Coordinator out of Legacy Region 6 in Denver. I and several other people in Region 6 have been working with Imtiaz and his team for about the last 5 or 6 years, specifically on future condition and how the CASC can help us, the service, integrate climate change into our SSA process. So it's been quite a evolution in how this has worked, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this summary climate metric table. So this is an example of a climate metric table that we create on the back end. So the Climate Toolbox does not create this at the moment, but we do use a lot of the tools within the Climate Toolbox to generate a climate metric table like this. This example is from the southern white-tailed ptarmigan. It's a recent SSA that Karen Newland was the lead biologist on and had a lot of input in this as well. But basically what we use the toolbox and through a selection process on the climate metrics, which is that first column, that's a conversation really between the lead biologist, the SSA core team, and also outside experts to try to determine which climate metrics may be the most impactful on the future condition of whatever the species under study is. And in this case, for the ptarmigan, you can see there's a lot of different metrics here that potentially are that were thought to be important. And the number of metrics really varies by species. Some of the small endemic plants with constricted ranges sometimes only have 3 or 4 or a handful of metrics that we're interested in. But the second column is really the seasonality of whether or not you're interested in spring values or annual average values or whatnot. You can generate all those, and then the very hot and dry, hot and very wet correspond to the 3 GCMs that were chosen through through the scatter plot process that Aimee talked about, and those correspond to, you can see just above the table, the different specific GCMs and the RCPs. And then the final column there is the historical value, which Aimee also talked about. And basically the numbers in the middle of the table are the deltas, the changes from historic under each one of those scenarios. And so all that's generated through the various tools in the toolbox. And I guess what I would say is, when we started doing this 5 years ago or so, this was super labor intensive. And, MTAS and myself and several biologists had to do a lot of number crunching of the raw data within Excel or other methods of crunching the data to actually generate the deltas. So this was a really time consuming process. And what's happened in the last year or two is that the toolbox has evolved to the point where this is becoming a lot easier to populate. And Katherine's going to talk here in just a couple of minutes about kind of what's in store in terms of the future application or the future developments for the toolbox. But I guess without ruining what she's going to talk about, you're going to be able to generate a table like this fairly quickly without having to do a lot of that labor intensive work to get there. The only other thing I would mention is that, a lot of times, as many people on this call know, we don't have a lot of specific information about the critter, whether that's thermal tolerance information or whatnot. But for the case of the ptarmigan, we did have some information on maximum thermal tolerance. So you can see one of the metrics on the right, the hottest summer day was really an important one to know under those different GCMs, because we did have an upper thermal tolerance where the ptarmigan became stressed. So that was an important one for ptarmigan and specifically for ptarmigan. And then the bottom right box is kind of a summary, like the highlight important points from the rest of the metrics that you see above. And MTAS has always been really instrumental in kind of doing an interpretation of what all those deltas really mean and kind of summarizing that in a concise way, which is what you see there. So, okay, next slide, please. So this is just kind of a quick, and this isn't comprehensive, but this is just a quick snapshot of several of the SSAs where we've used the Climate Toolbox. And like I said, we kind of started down this path in 2017, where we did some work on the Wolverine SSA. And, we've just kind of continually worked together to help, I guess, provide input to Katherine and MTAS on, what the service would like to see in terms of tool development to help us get the information that we really need. And it's really come a long way. And I'm pretty excited about the next year or so, because the new developments are going to be, I think, really useful and make our job a lot easier. And I guess one of the other goals I would say is, we want our Fish and Wildlife Service biologists to be able to use these tools themselves and generate the data they need without a whole lot of input from the outside. So it just makes that's really the goal of the tool, is to make, one of the goals of the tool for the service is to make it as easy to use as possible, so that anybody within the service can use it. So next slide. And I just wanted to put a plug in. MTAS was a lead author on this paper in the journal Climate. Was a few other people involved, including service biologists, but it really kind of lays out a lot of what has been talked about already in terms of the process for being able to integrate future climate projections into future condition and SSAs, and also the uncertainties surrounding a lot of those. And so I'd encourage all of you to take a look at that paper. There's also a lot of links in there to the different tools as well. And I think I'm going to pass it back to Katherine. Thank you.
Oops. Great, thanks, Don. And so the last part of this talk is just a really quick intro into what we're planning. So because there's such a demand for SSAs, both future SSAs for species and also updating old SSAs too. And the use of the toolbox is really valuable in streamlining this. But to this point, that it's been very manual to create those reports and to get data from the toolbox. So what we're proposing right now is to streamline those SSAs with a proposed new tool for the Climate Toolbox. And we just have a sneak peek here into some mock-ups of what that new tool would look like. But basically that new tool would allow the user to select a location for the habitat. So just like the other tools in the toolbox, they could select a point location, a rectangular area, a watershed, an ecoregion, tribal land, their own custom boundary as well. They're going to be able to select a future climate from a time period, a future time period, and then also select both an RCP scenario and a specific model. And this is to fit in with their scenario study, where they select a model to represent a hot and wet scenario, or a model to represent a warmer and dry model, say. And then they also select a whole bunch of summary metrics, some metrics that are seasonal climate metrics like winter temperature or winter precipitation, and then also annual metrics like coldest winter day or day of first fall freeze. And basically they just checkbox this here and either add it to the report or not. And what happens is then the tool is going to generate a report that's going to hopefully be very similar to the report that they actually have been using for the last couple years. And this is kind of just again a sneak peek at what it looks like right now. At least we're trying to replicate that report as much as possible. So it has the different hot, wet, the different scenarios, has the historical value, and it has all of the metrics that have been listed or have been selected. The other thing that this proposed tool is going to do is to provide links to the spatial data, the geospatial raster data for the different projections. Sometimes it's useful for the fish and wildlife biologists to actually look at their habitat region and see how these projections vary spatially within it, especially in areas like Colorado, where there's a lot of spatial variation due to topography. And so we just kind of have just a way to streamline it so that the biologist doesn't have to look all over the place. They can look at the same things that they selected, the same scenarios that they selected, and they just can click on the link and download the geospatial data for those projections in a GeoTIFF format. Yeah, and so that's basically what we have as a proposed new tool. And in conclusion, we just have that SSAs to inform Species Endangered Species Act decision-making. We saw that with Alex in the very beginning. SSAs often require climate information to determine a species condition. The Climate Toolbox provides historical and future climate data for a location in the contiguous USA, which helps out. Current US fish and wildlife methods for extracting toolbox information are too manual to keep up with the demand for new SSAs and updating old SSAs. And this new toolbox tool will organize needed information for SSAs to help streamline the SSA process. And that is it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Katherine, and thank you all the speakers. I see on the comments in the chat box, people really appreciating the tool and where it can go from here. So thank you for those comments. So we have a few questions that have been submitted through the chat box, and I'm sure others will have questions and comments as well. And we may go 5 or 10 minutes over time today just to make sure we cover some of these questions. So if you feel free to hang around if you can. Yeah, I also wanted to say that today we broke our attendance record. So our last record was 108 people attending these webinars, and we made 114. So that's a great achievement for us. Great. Okay, so I'll get started with some of these questions, and I think some of these questions are coming right at you, Katherine, for now. So about the toolbox, is the toolbox just for land areas?
Yes, it is. It is.
Yes, it doesn't extend into ocean. And I have another question about if the toolbox is also available for the Pacific Islands, Hawaii, for example.
It's not. It's over the contiguous USA, so it's not for Hawaii and not for Alaska, unfortunately. Yeah, there are. Well, anyway.
Yeah.
No, currently not.
Have it all. No tool is perfect, right? A question from Gary. What are the plans for updating to newer generation to CMIP 6? And I'm sure
that's
many
right.
others are wanting to hear that answer.
Yep. So we're the Climate Toolbox is covering CMIP 5 projections, as I shared, and the CMIP 6 projections are out. And we have actually in our group been actively downloading them and starting to prepare to do a downscaling. So I hate to give promises, but we most likely have funding to do this, and likely we maybe could be done by the end of the year. This downscaling process is fairly laborious and definitely computationally intensive, so it's a hard thing to do. But yes, we're planning on doing something with CMIP 6, And of course, CMIP6, if we do it, will show up in the Climate Toolbox.
Right. Yeah, we look forward to that. So I'll combine these two questions, slightly different, but about, individual, models themselves have variability in precip. So is there a tool that can show that? Because I think that the question was about the box plot, if that can show, variability within the model, within a single model for something like precip.
Right, that's right. So the dots represented the different models. And so we could see different values coming from the different models and see the spread or the uncertainty in the different precipitation projections. That's
but if
correct.
one is interested in what's happening within a single model in terms of year-to-year variability, where can they go to get that?
Within, you mean the different ensembles? Or
No, within a single model. So people interested in what's the variability within the model. So like you see climate variability in the historical period, you would do a time series, right? So can they, well, am I making my question clear?
I don't know.
A single, so within a single scenario, within a single GCM, if somebody's interested in looking at the spread in precipitation.
They can download the data. We have a data download tool in the Climate Toolbox that you can actually download the data for a specific model. So there is a data download tool, and you can select future data, and you can actually, if you want to look at a specific model, you can select a certain model, and you can actually download either the monthly or the daily data here. So you can see the variability within a model of, say, precipitation, like you were saying, and then actually download it from 1950 to 2005, and you'll get daily data back in a Excel file for a point location. Like here is selected just point location. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Very
Okay.
well. Yeah, I think that question was thinking if the box plot could do that, and obviously it cannot. It does
Yeah,
not
the
look
box
at
plot already
within a
has
model.
summaries
Right.
for each model. That's right.
So, and a question about the box plot is, can you look at trends or do statistical analysis of trends in box plot?
Yeah, you'd have to download the data there from the box plots tool.
Right. So a question about the new tool that we're proposing. When will that become available?
And MTS, you can answer that one.
Well, yeah, we're still waiting for the project to start, waiting for the funds for the Congress to kind of give us the blessing and move that project forward. So just waiting for that to happen. A question about the CMIP6 and which SSPs would you like to include?
Yeah, so we are looking right now at SSP 3.7.
And can you explain SSPs, please? Sorry.
I don't remember the acronym. Oh my gosh.
So SSP is something like RCPs and CMIP5. These are shared socioeconomic pathways.
Socioeconomic pathways, right. I think SSP 3's, okay, so we're looking at SSP 585. The 8.5 is like an RCP 8.5, and the 5 represents a certain economic pathway. So we're looking at SSP 585, SSP 370. The 70 represents a RCP like 7.0. That's part I know. We're also looking at SSP 245, which is like the 4.5 is like RCP 4.5, and the other part is like an economic pathway. And we may do SSP 126. I'm unsure about that right now. So we're looking at 4 right now, but that's for the future.
Oh, that's great. That'll be a lot of work. Are there plans to expand the cover of hydrologic variables beyond the Western US?
For the future projections, that is correct. The future projections are only available for the Western US for the hydrologic variables. And that's because this was part of an integrated scenarios project that was done like 5 to 8 years ago. There are certain people, there are certain organizations that are using the MACA data and the CMIP5 to run some other hydrology models. Currently, I only know of one that may happen, but so I don't know if there are plans for that.
Great. Thanks, Katherine. That's all the questions that were submitted through the chat box, but anybody can feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or provide a comment. You can also turn on your video if you want.
Yeah, hi, this is Steve Miller out in the Pacific Islands. Is there any schedule for doing a similar project throughout the Pacific Islands area? It represents 1/3 of all the endangered species, so it seems like it should be getting a certain amount of weight.
There is potential that for our group that we may be replacing some of our input data for GridMet to use ERA 5, which ERA 5 land, and that does cover the Pacific Islands and also Alaska. So we are still exploring that. It's looking pretty likely, but again, that's probably going to take some time. And then for MACA projections too, we need to use that GridMet using ERA 5 land. So I don't know. It's something that we're trying to do. We realize that, Alaska and Pacific Islanders need data as well.
Yeah, part of the complication is that in the Pacific Islands, we have to look at the, 3 different climate analyses, one south of the equator, one in the Western Pacific, and then finally the sort of normal climate system that is used for the continental US. So it makes it considerably more complex when we start dealing with those species.
Yeah, and thank you for those comments. Katherine, I think the next challenge for Climate Toolbox to go beyond CONUS.
Jay Alder has a nice comment in the
Yes.
chat about the availability of hydrology for CONUS. LOCA does have, there is a VIC pairing of the LOCA statistical downscaling method that's available over CONUS, and that's something that for those locations outside of the Western USA that we have in the toolbox, you could use LOCA plus VIC for that to get the hydrology.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I know that stakeholders really desire good hydrology projections, soil moisture, stream flow, etc. And we have limited data available. I mean, there are these data that Jay mentioned here with the Bureau of Reclamation, which is probably one of the best coverage of the CONUS data set. But really, I mean, we do lack good data, and can we trust some of these data? And sometimes we look at hydrologic projections across different projects, and they're giving different, scenarios for the future. The results look different. So I think more needs to be done here to kind of bring high confidence hydrology projections, and that's something that we can then bring through Climate Toolbox. So a big need.
I think the last Robin Niver, who just had a question. I think this is a good one for either John or Aimee. So even though the climate data in the toolbox is out to 2100, why is Fish and Wildlife looking at example projections to 2050?
Go ahead, Aimee. Do you want to talk about why you guys chose that foreseeable future?
Sure. It had more to do with some of the other stressors. It was partially climate related, but also we're considering future changes in all of those different metrics. So some of those metrics might change based on changes in land management and things like that. And so we try to find a balance between having reliable climate data, but also having reliable predictions about how other conditions like species stressors are going to change into the future.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation. I just add that, foreseeable future, which is kind of the endpoint, that's the term we use for the endpoint, and the projections depends on a lot of different things. And that's really kind of up to the SSA core team to determine where their comfort level is in terms of, a lot of it's the uncertainty when you push out beyond 2060, 2070, the uncertainty goes way up. And so that's oftentimes the reason behind going with a mid-century endpoint versus an end of century endpoint.
John, can you or Imtiaz talk more to that a little bit of like that uncertainty and its increase after mid-century and what that means for how we can handle data after mid-century, if at all? And because I know this is questions that's come up internally in Fish and Wildlife Service too.
Yeah, I actually would like Imtiaz to answer it, because that was really one of the main focuses of the paper, the climate in the journal Climate. And it is documented in detail in that paper, but Imtiaz, I don't know, do you have some just kind of quick comments on that?
Yeah, thanks, John. And yeah, we did try to document that piece quite a bit in the paper. And it's really primarily the uncertainty related to the emission scenarios that by mid-century, it's really 20, 30 years out, there's very little difference between what emission scenarios you choose in terms of differences across climate change, climate projections. But beyond 2050, the emission scenarios try to diverge. And so working with that even greater uncertainty really becomes very clear going beyond 2050. So, managers mostly want to look not too far out into the future with that kind of uncertainty. But we also talk about that you can then maybe work with specific emission scenarios if you want to go back that far out. And we also talk about the likelihood of these different emission scenarios, because there has been analysis done and papers have come out talking about how likely an 8.5 scenario is versus 4.5 scenario, given current policy makeup of things.
I add one more comment onto that, is that when we're looking at these future scenarios, we really are focusing on what can, not just what's that range of like all the possible scenarios out there. We're really zeroing in on what are those plausible future scenarios. So we want to be able to manage that level of uncertainty and stick to what we can have some reasonable confidence may happen in the future.
Any last comment or question? Well, thank you all very much for staying back and joining today. And I just want to thank all our speakers again for this great presentation. And we hope to see you all at our next webinar. And thank you so much.